Welcome to Second Table, where we discuss spirituality, philosophy, and psychology. I'm your host, Winston Janis. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for listening back again for another episode of the Second Table podcast. Today, I'm very excited. I'm joined with by the authors of a brand new book entitled Soul Journeys, Christian Spirituality and Shamanism as Pathways for Wholeness and Understanding. So with me today, the authors, it's three authors that collaborated on this work. Daniel Prechtel, John Mabry, and Katrina Leathers. So normally, like I said, I would kind of give an introduction for each of you, but I thought maybe it'd be easier if perhaps each of you could go around and kind of say a little bit about your background and how you came to write this book together. So I don't know, just for the sake of, I don't know, Daniel, would you be comfortable maybe starting?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Winston, for giving us the opportunity to be able to meet with you and do this podcast. It's really exciting. So I'm Daniel Prechtel. I've been an Episcopal priest for 36 years, or coming on to that. Most of my time, I certainly was a parish priest for a number of years. And have helped out in parishes beyond that. But much of my work has been in the field of spiritual direction, as well as teaching different resources for spiritual guidance. So I've worked with a couple of seminaries and worked with two spiritual direction training programs. And in that context, I got to meet John and Katrina. When I made the move to the Bay in San Francisco area in 2009. And so these became colleagues of mine in spiritual direction work. And in that, we started doing some collaboration on how do we engage in a sense of the reality of spiritual realities often in a culture that doesn't have a lot of room for that. Even within Christianity, a kind of a rationalist structure. And how do we find ways within mainstream in Christianity to kind of break that open and look at some of our traditions and our practices, but also then kind of learning from Katrina around core shamanism, and then I went through training that process too. So that was bringing me into relationship with these wonderful people.
Great, thanks, Daniel.
Welcome.
I don't know. Does maybe Katrina want to go next, or?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Winston, for inviting us. It's a delight to be here. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm honored to have you guys.
Yeah, lovely. So I come at it from a different direction than Daniel and John, actually, because I was raised a Baha'i, grew up in a Baha'i family, which relatively new religion, and never was a Christian in any way in my life. And went through my adulthood, spiritually speaking, not really having a home, and professionally speaking, went into psychology, became an expressive arts therapist. And then about midlife, I encountered shamanism at a point where I was really much in need of spiritual grounding and a spiritual perspective. I hit a crisis, actually couple crises within a few years, and just instantly dived into shamanic practice, because for me it was the place where I most immediately felt able to connect to a sense of the divine in a tangible way, which for me, I had, grown up with a beautiful exposure to a concept of God that was loving and good and all of that. But the shamanic work really, for me, dropped me into it in a deep relationship to spirit in a way that I could never have found previously. So I ended up, partly because of that, going into interfaith chaplaincy and became ordained as an interfaith chaplain, and then as a spiritual director, certified, working with Daniel and John, beloved gifts from both of them in my education, religiously and professionally. And then Daniel and I began doing some work together with the shamanic work because he began doing it. And this collaboration with the two of them has just been a delightful dialogue. They bring the bulk of what is in this book, but it's been a great dialogue with both of them. So I think that covers it.
Great. Yeah. And I'm sure we'll get into this, but at some point, I think maybe for our listeners, because for myself, like a definition of shamanism, having approached this book, I really am coming to it with pretty fresh eyes. I only heard the term shamanism really only a little bit before reading this book, so it was really kind of opening my eyes to knowing more what that is about. So I wonder if maybe our listeners could do well with like a definition or some sort of explanation of what we mean when we're talking about shamanism.
Yeah, really good question, and I'll briefly respond, and John and Daniel may also wish to, but the term shamanism is a very broad term. It's referring to a set of practices that have existed for millennia over the globe from all different continents. It is, as I understand it, the oldest set of practices, spiritually speaking, that exist on this history of humankind. So shamanism is the practices of connecting to spirit directly in some method, typically using some sort of sonic driver, as it's called, drumming or rattling or something similar to that. Different cultures have different versions of what we are clumping together into shamanism, but it's sort of, I think of it as a direct relationship to spiritual beings as we understand them or experiencing them, or as we experience them. Many cultures have individuals, in fact, most cultures, I think, have individuals who are specially trained and often selected in some way to be the bridge between the spirit world and humanity. That's most typical. I was trained, and then Daniel and John have both also done some training with the Foundation for Shamanic Studies, which was started by Michael Harner, which really has taken the global perspective of practices all over the place and distilled from that the core essence of what shamanic cultures are doing, what they're teaching, how they're practicing, what their beliefs are. So these set of core practices are what the Foundation for Shamanic Studies teaches in their training programs, and what I dived into 15 years ago when I started on this path. I think that's what I'll say, and I don't know if Daniel and John want to add something to that. Okay,
great. Yeah, I just want to say too that I love the opening sentence of the book, which is that shaman is a word that is relatively new in our Western vocabulary, even though it refers to a form of spiritual practitioner that reaches back 30,000 to 70,000 years. Yeah, so that's pretty intense for sure. And by the way, one of my best friends, his name is Morgan. He's actually done 2 podcast episodes with me. He was also raised Baha'i. So yeah, but yeah, like I said, I'd like to open it up for others. I know John, if you'd like to give a little intro, and if you wanted to add anything to your perspective on or the definition of shamanism, and just to give a little context how this conversation came about. A few years ago, I had come across a great book, Growing into God, that John Mabry wrote. And it was really all about Christian mysticism, and kind of giving an introduction and elaborating about the whole tradition of Christian mysticism. And I really enjoyed that book, being a fan of many of the Christian mystics, especially like Meister Eckhart. And so, I was looking at my shelf and thinking, who else could I reach out to interview for this podcast? And the timing was really kind of perfect, because I reached out to John and said, hey, I'd love to interview you. And he said, you know what, we just released this brand new book, and it seems like the timing's perfect. So, but anyway, go ahead and introduce yourself, John.
Okay, sure. So I'm John Mabry. I am a United Church of Christ pastor. I've been pastoring my congregation in Berkeley for 26 years now, I think. I am also the director of the Interfaith Spiritual Direction Certificate Program at the Chaplaincy Institute, where Katrina is dean. And I also teach comparative theology there. And I got into shamanism because of a difficult time I was going through in my life almost 20 years ago now. That's amazing. My therapist was training as doing the training in core shamanism, and she said, I think doing a shamanic journey might be really helpful for you. And I said, what's that? So she did some education and got out her drum, and I laid down on the floor, and bang, I had this kind of wild shamanic journey that I didn't know was even possible. And it was super helpful. It was really amazing. And so I kept doing it, and with my therapist, and I went to some other shamans, and had never really considered it becoming a shamanic practitioner myself, but it's certainly something that I practiced for myself as a form of spiritual discernment. And as I think I've shared with you before, Winston, I'm a novelist. And so, of course, anything I'm doing finds its way into my novels. And so I started writing a character whose shamanism was his deal. And in that novel, I started to do the work of how does this integrate with Christian spirituality? I think that's the way novelists approach life is, they work out their issues through their novels. And I didn't even realize this was an issue until I started working on this character. I actually learned a lot through that experience. Sometimes, I let shamanism go for a few years, but I always kind of come back to it because there's something here that's really engaging and really valuable. And eventually, I did it to the point where it became my prayer life, and it kind of permanently changed how I pray. I don't think that, if somebody asked me, what are you doing in your prayer? It wouldn't sound that much different from what any other Christian is doing, but the technique, the method that I'm using in order to talk to Jesus is the Shamanic Journey. And it's kind of an incredible tool for intimacy with the divine, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what fascinated me so much about the book, is because in a way, I've also had my own struggles with prayer and wanting to feel a more intimate connection with the divine, and an intimate connection with God and Jesus as a Christian, right? I think I shared, I'm also UCC pastor, and I'm a very visual person, and so this idea of this imaginal prayer, and I don't know if that has anything to do with, like, I think at one point I was reading in the book about the different, I forget if it's Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram, the INFPs. I think, yes, if I remember correctly, I think I am an INFP as well. So the two different types of people who are drawn to this type of practice, right? But it's really interesting because and Daniel touched upon this when you were introducing yourself, just that as you shared, I think when we were talking a little bit through email, John, that in progressive Christianity, I think there is, in a way, a resistance to this type of thing. Like, wait a minute, are you talking about talking with spirits, right? Because I think that people basically, like myself, I think this happened to so many other people who are kind of identify as more sort of progressive Christians. They've gone through a deconstruction, right? And I think you shared that yourself and Daniel were raised in sort of more strict or fundamentalist sort of Christian backgrounds, and I would say that's mostly true for myself as well. That kind of this certain understanding of Christianity, of taking the Bible literally, and then going through this deconstruction. And it seems like when we go through this deconstruction, it's almost like there's that risk in a way of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's like, I think of like, it's almost the same thing as being, say, bitter that you find out Santa Claus is not real, right? And then all of a sudden there's this distrust of. Although we have, I think, within us this hunger for magic, for wonder, for connection with something that is greater than just ourselves and this material world, there's a kind of resistance to that. And that's part of what I was interested in exploring as being part of that audience of, say, progressive Christianity, or people, who really do believe and respect science. There's this derogatory term, right? Like woo-woo, like things are woo-woo. And I think that was a little bit of the sense I got at first when reading the book. I almost, thought that, at least for my own particular self, like that maybe chapter 2 would have been a good start for me in the book. Because, John, when you wrote chapter 2, you were talking about kind of justifying some of the things and making it sort of more accessible or palatable, I suppose, to sort of the rationalistic mind that we have as Westerners and as people in the contemporary time. I do think that people have good reasons for being wary of the sort of, woo-woo stuff, as they call it, right? Because I just think about, especially in today's world, how much the false information that's going around everywhere on the web, and what kind of impact that's having on the world. I'm thinking, anti-vaxxers, the people who flat earthers, right? Climate change deniers. It's understandable in a way that scientists are frustrated with people for taking sort of stances that aren't in agreement with a scientific perspective. Now you have people protesting wearing masks as another thing, right? I saw a headline, a pastor was saying he could claim to cure coronavirus, and then through faith, and then dies of coronavirus, right? So I guess my question to you all might be, what might you say to those listeners who, when they hear of this talk of communicating with spirits, feel that it's kind of out there and maybe have a great deal of skepticism? How can it be made accessible to, like I said, this hyper-rational contemporary mind?
A couple of things that come to mind for me. One is that within the mainline Christianity that I understand through the Episcopal Church, we've had some practices that are deeply rooted, but they're practices for the spiritual dimension of healing. Things like laying on of hands with prayer. It's done quietly. It's not done in the, as a big kind of a sensational thing. Often it's done, but it also is integrated into a sense that, of course, Jesus is interested in people's healing, and that we can engage the spiritual dimension of God's presence and desires, just as we can engage the scientific dimensions, the medical practices that are traditional, that are ordinary Western medicine. then too, and that they don't have to be in contention with each other. They can be complementary to each other, so that the one helps further empower the other then too. My approach, and certainly I think mainstream Christianity is interested in that sense of treating the whole human being. And even the notion of salvation is one of wholeness rather than some kind of formula that all of a sudden guarantees us eternal life. Mm-hmm. So we don't have to be in a place of contention with the spiritual, or with the scientific community, with the medical community. We can be partners in that. And that very much is both the approach that I understand in Christianity and its healing practices, and also in core shamanism. We mentioned the shaman maintains contact, or has contact with spirits, but we didn't quite say why, and that's an important thing. The shaman is operating on behalf of their own needs, or the needs of their community, or the needs of of a person, and that they're seeking a sense of power and help from the spiritual reality that is present in the beings there that are compassionate spirits, and that their power and their presence is brought into the situation that the person is needing either healing for or guidance on. As whether in Christian terms we might talk about discernment, or a sense of healing. And so we partner with the best of Western understandings and technologies and that kind of thing, and don't have to be put into a place of it's either this or that. Rather, it's a partnership. These are approaches toward wholeness and toward deep understanding that's going on. And the shaman's role has been that. And also in Christianity, there have been people that provide ministries of guidance and people that provide ministries of healing practices then on behalf of people as well. So it's bringing these two wonderful traditions together. In Christianity, often we have helping spirits that we pray to, and the tradition is replete with stories of the mystics and stories of healing, where the intercessions of Mary or other saints or Christ's presence helps bring people restoration to new health or guidance in the life situations they're seeking. And so we need to have, in Christianity, we need to have the spiritual technology, if you will, the spiritual practices renewed for our time to be able to do that. Just as in shamanism, there's a sense of renewal of those practices now that are geared also toward a Western mindset. And the foundation's work has primarily been to be able to say what is core to shamanic practices, what's either universally or near universally or cross-culturally practices that practitioners of shamanism engage. And so those are the practices that we've been trained in as well.
Very interesting. Yeah. It makes me think of, like, at one point, it was said in the book that the imagination is is essentially an organ of spiritual perception. So it does seem to me like there is this neglected aspect that is of ourselves, of our experience, that has all this potential for spiritual experience. And so, right, I've just been very fascinated by that. Do any of John or Katrina, do you want to speak to that question as Daniel did?
I'll jump in briefly. One of the tenets of the Baha'i faith, of many, is that there will come a time in the future where spirituality and, or as they say, religion and science will be united, that they will not be in conflict. Mm-hmm. And I hold that with this sense of deep humility about the limits of what we know scientifically and spiritually. Do we really know what spiritual reality is? Do we have any sense what God or the divine actually is? And does science really, have we gotten anywhere near the limits of what science would actually be able to perceive at some point in time? I think we have really no idea. But what we can know is what we experienced. And you bringing up the imaginal realm that is so critical in this, that my experience of something, I don't know from what it comes. Does it come from my imagination? Is it a gift from the divine, from spirit or God, or however I understand that great mystery? It is something that's given, that's a means of understanding and connecting to the power of spiritual practice. So, and also I just want to throw in, when you mentioned the book Growing into God, which I adored that book because it spoke to the mystical experience of, in that context, Christians, but I really resonated with it as a shamanic practitioner as well, because mystics of all traditions are connecting in ways that I understand essentially through my shamanic lens. I don't see that there is a distinction. So I'm not really answering your question maybe, but to say that in all religious traditions, we're doing the same thing of grappling with something we totally can't understand yet through the limited we have to experience it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things. I want to highlight some quotes and stuff from the book, but I think, John, you're writing in regard to the mystic Julian of Norwich, where you wrote, one could dismiss, because Julian of Norwich, she had a fever, and there was some hallucinations going on, right? But or were they, right? But one could dismiss this as a hallucination born of illness, except that the revelations given to her in that experience formed the basis of her writing for the next 20 years, and is one of the most splendid and powerful works of mystical literature in the English language. All right, so yeah, it's a good point, right? That from the imagination or not, it seems like the effects of these experiences are very real and undeniable. So I don't know, too, John, if you wanted to speak at all to the concept. I know you I think it was John that had the concept of the living room versus the chapel. I think that also might be helpful to kind of elaborate on and explain what you meant by that, if that makes sense.
Well, I think that there's so much conflict, I think, between religious fundamentalism and science, and I think progressive Christians, or even just mainline Christians, have always said, we're not going to have that conflict. We're not going to go there. But what's happened is that, in really internalizing the scientific worldview, we've desacralized nature, we've desacralized the world, and we've really bought that. Mm-hmm. Even we Christians who have decided we're going to accept the scientific worldview, we've accepted it to the point where we no longer live in a sacred universe. We no longer actually live. We live with the Christian story, but we don't live in the Christian story because we no longer believe it.
Right.
How many sermons have you heard explaining away miracles, or explaining away like the ascension, which we just preached on a couple of days ago, or even, I have even been in Christian churches where they explain away the resurrection because science says this isn't possible, therefore it isn't, and we don't believe it, and we no longer live inside of our story. And I think what I was talking about there is that science has given us this living room where we all have our common space, and we all agree that there are things that are provable and things that are not provable and so forth. But there's also the chapel, and the chapel has different rules. Different rules apply there, and in our house, we don't always live in one room. And so to associate or to familiarize ourselves with the chapel and get to know how do things work here, because they don't work the same way as they work in the living room. Because in the chapel, imagination has a place. The sacred is infuses everything. It's a sacralized universe in that room, and I know it sounds like I'm kind of advocating compartmentalization. It's not really what I'm doing. I'm really just trying to highlight different ways of understanding reality and the different ways of being in the world. And I think that what Katrina was getting at is that science can't explain everything.
Right.
There's still plenty of mystery in the world. And so let's not deny that mystery. Let's engage with it. Let's be in relationship with it. Let's have the courage to think that the wisdom that we've been given through our traditions was really onto something.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I wrote a blog post talking about the hunger for magic and wonder in our society. This is why I think Harry Potter and Game of Thrones are so popular, right? It's like, because in a way, the scientific perspective, as useful and important as I think it is, I think it's very crucial. At the same time, there's a danger of kind of falling into, lovemaking is just procreation, right? To perpetuate the species, or birds fly just so they can find food or whatever, right? Instead of seeing that there is this, like you're saying, John, this deeper dimension in which we can see everything as sacred, as magical in a sense, truly magical, Daniel, I think you wanted to say something. Is that right?
Yeah, I wanted just to kind of build on that. One of the things Katrina mentioned, that Michael Harner was kind of the pioneer of core shamanism. Harner was a cultural anthropologist, and he always saw himself as a social scientist. And he always maintained that the shamanic journey experience is one that would pass muster in terms of scientific method, that it is replicable. The journey takes one to another realm, if you will, and brings back a sense of something that is useful for a person or for a community. And because it can be replicated, because many people can do this, then there is an empirical basis for the shamanic experience. I mean, that was his argument then too. And the sense was, what kind of product is produced in these practices? I'd say whether they're Christian healing or discernment practices, or whether there are divination and healing practices in shamanism, that these are things that are, it's like Christianity, kind of maybe building on John's images of chapel in the living room, there's that sense that we have the opportunity to be able to put different lenses on to reality. There is the scientific worldview in its pursuits is incredible and fabulous and brings a lot of wonderful things to us in our lives and enriches us. But also there's that sense that that within that community, there can be a real closed kind of system that's saying, no, nothing really is real unless it meets a particular kind of criterion. What we need is a bigger lens than two, or we need to shift lenses and be able to say that kind of we can see things from a from a scientific standpoint, and we can benefit from that. But there can also be a lot of problems that come out of that viewpoint as well. But we can also put on lenses that really are born out of ancient wisdom traditions, that train people to be seers, or train people to be able to be in touch with spiritual realities, then too, that are connected with our lived experience and influence us whether we're aware of it or not. So let's become aware of it and be able to engage it with a certain sense of the guidance from the teachers from the past on that.
Yeah. As a former, I used to work as a licensed mental health counselor, a therapist, and although I didn't practice primarily in this way, there's internal family systems in which is involved kind of talking with different parts of your psyche, right? And it reminds me of that, if anybody's seen the Disney or the Pixar film Inside Out, in which the protagonist, Riley, right, she's talking with the different parts of herself.
Wonderful.
Disgust, sadness, joy, anger, fear, all these parts of herself, and there's this dialogue that happens within the movie, and I think within you can have this dialogue with different parts of yourself in the internal family systems. So it's like it reminds me, okay, so there's really something to that modality as a psychotherapeutic modality, and so this has similarities that it makes me think of, like we said, whether we're talking about spiritual reality or whether we're talking about psychological reality. It sounds like still there's either way, it's still, we're talking about something really interesting and powerful, I mean, to take a spiritual perspective of it, it kind of reminded me of what had a profound, it's a little bit of a new agey book, but Conversations with God by Neil Donald Walsh. I sort of had this awakening moment when I read part of that book, which the author was questioning, the author is basically writing a dialogue between himself and God, and is also dictating the thoughts of God, right? And at one point he says, how can I know this is communication from God and not just my own imagination, right? And then God, quote unquote, right, responds, what would be the difference? Do you not see that I could just as easily work through your imagination as anything else, right? That kind of speaks to this issue that we're talking about, that if we are all completely interconnected, which is one of the insights of studying various forms of spirituality, including Christianity and Buddhism, that I've found, then what's to say that our minds are not connected in some way with these deeper realities, that basically our minds are an expression of God or the universe in the deepest level, so that, right, yeah.
I think that we have a tendency to use the word imagination or imaginal as a smaller version of what it may actually be. Such that if we say, well, it's imaginary, it's just made up, it's not real, as if imagination just comes from some materialist source, whether it's our brain cells or I don't know what.
Right.
Whereas if one thinks of imagination as opening to channeling spirit, so to speak, not to get too woo-woo myself, but seriously, do we know where inspiration comes from? Do we know? I mean, you can look through creative and scientific history at the innumerable examples of things that have emerged through an imaginary process or a dream or something like that, where something is given that is amazing and profound and feels like it's much beyond just the individual's cognitive limitations, so to speak. Like, what are those limitations? Maybe they're not really what we think they are.
Right. I think at one point in the book, it was raised this issue of like, I mean, one of my goals with the podcast has been to recover sort of the, the relevance and the deeper meanings of the Christian tradition, and how that sometimes gets lost when people just kind of write off, all these Christians are the same. But then, right, like we said, going through this deconstruction process, then it's, as important as social justice issues are, and I think they're a very, central expression of what it means to be a Christian. I think what we're talking about here is recovering some of the sort of foundational stuff that also has been part of this sort of spiritual experience that almost transcends us, our physical reality or just being part of something much larger, but and in connection too with what you're talking about with imagination, it's just another side thought that hit me is like what it must have been like for human beings as we've evolved, to have this cognitive power that we have of imagination, that there was a point at which perhaps there was no such thing as imagination as we know it as human beings, and all of a sudden human beings had this cognitive power, and I could see the ability to see things in our minds, right? And I could see how and easily understand how the first humans might see something deeply spiritual and divine about our ability to imagine. I think it's part of what makes us human, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely that, yes.
And John, you were talking as well about just writing characters, and it made me think in a way of, it's almost like I was thinking about all these concepts and how, in a way, I hear authors talk about how characters take on a life of their own, and it's kind of like Harry Potter is, in a way, the dream of J.K. Rowling, but then Harry Potter takes on a life of his own, and so I don't know. It is a fascinating thing as we think about the connection between the reality that you experience in these altered states of consciousness. I don't know. It just makes me wonder. Perhaps just as we dream up these characters, perhaps we are God's dream.
Yeah.
Well, and in fact, Hinduism says that we're, that we're the dream of Vishnu. So, I think there's some precedent there. Katrina was talking about imagination, and the theologian Henry Corbin came up with the word imaginal, specifically to distinguish it from what we think of as just imagination, as if imagination was not a formidable and great thing, but in fact, to suggest that there's something more going on here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the questions I had too was I thought might be important to address just in terms of a Christian context. Do you think maybe one of you could sort of talk a little bit about the precedent, the script, like for example, scriptural examples or general examples of shamanic practices within the Christian tradition, just to kind of explore that connection in a more deep way, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So, Scripture, of course, is full of very wild, imaginal kind of scenes, especially in the apocalyptic literature. So you look at Daniel, or you look at Revelation, and you can. It's not hard to see these as shamanic journeys. That you come, that the writer is going into this other world, like the author of Revelation, and is seeing all of these things, and then is bringing that wisdom back and writing about it for his community in order to heal them, in order to help them.
Yeah.
That is the very definition of shamanism. The shaman goes into the other world to get the medicine, and that medicine is wisdom, to bring back to the community in order to restore wholeness and balance and harmony.
So I think the prophetic tradition, I think, is as John is referring to, is really replete with that sense of the possibility of shamanic journeys, visions, lots and lots of visions of the night, dreams that have a sense of really pressing power to be able to share with the community as part of that. John.
Well, and the practice that probably mirrors core shamanism the closest within the Christian tradition is Ignatian, the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius. Where you do a series of guided meditations, basically, where you vividly imagine one of the scenes from the gospel, and then you notice what you see in that scene that isn't in the gospels. What are you smelling? What are people saying around you? What did Jesus say in your encounter with him that isn't recorded in the scriptures? And then, after you do this kind of this vivid imaginary prayer, then you go back to your spiritual director and you unpack it, and you figure out what all of those things meant, with the expectation that what was shown to you in this prayer is for your own spiritual benefit. It's for your own healing, for your own for your own formation.
Interesting. Yeah, there is so much, I think, right, like depending on what worldview you take, but even from a materialistic worldview, I think there is therapeutic potential there. Absolutely. It's really very, very fascinating. And go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to mention something, and that is, Winston, you were talking about your psychotherapeutic work then too. And, I've been a student of Jungian psychology, analytic psychology, and post-Jungian work then too. And that spoke very strongly to me in my formation as an adult Christian through the work of Morton Kelsey and John Stanford. These were people that really interpreted, that brought those analytic insights into Christian spirituality. And I wanted to just kind of mention that Carl Jung, his father was a Protestant minister, and the kind of Protestantism that was replete at that time was very dry and very heady, and that he really broke with his father over that, and it didn't feed him spiritually at all, and it really brought him into the quest of of his own discoveries of what he called archetypes then too. And it was in the engaging of that there was a tremendous amount of spiritual potential and healing potential that was present, that really drove his work then too. So I just want to kind of say that sense of that that linking of that sense of there can be a kind of a two-dimensional Christianity that that really doesn't open up the depth and the potential of spiritual life. And unfortunately, Jung, he was fascinated by the rituals and the power of the rituals that Roman Catholic Church had, the Eucharist, the Mass, those kinds of things were fascinating, but he could never join that because he at core had been Protestant. there was a loss in that. John, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think we're still kind of dancing around making excuses for shamanism because it's somehow therapeutic, and I want to just kind of put out there the bold notion that what we are experiencing is something real. That we're actually interacting with spirits that have an objective reality of their own and that are interested in our health and our healing. And the audacious notion that when we enter into prayer, we're actually, it's possible to actually have an intimate exchange and an intimate and deepening relationship with Jesus. And I know you say that in a lot of mainline churches, people are just going to excuse themselves and walk away from you because that's not the kind of language that they like to hear, or and it makes them uncomfortable. That's, the notion of intimacy with Jesus is something evangelicals do really, really well. Yeah. And it's something that we've lost. I feel like we have sold our birthright for a bowl of porridge. There's a lot that we've gained by jettisoning a lot of the fundamentalist rigor, but I think that in the process that we have lost what is most beautiful and tender and valuable about our tradition, which is this intimate connection of the soul with its love.
No, it's well said. It's a great point, and like I said earlier, in a way, I kind of get it. I understand, and I think there are good reasons maybe for being wary of it. Just kind of take cautious because I think a lot of Christians are trying to disidentify from sort of evangelical fundamentalist Christianity for, once again, a lot of good reasons, and saying we're not like those Christians, right? But like you said, on the other hand, there is some, I think, are we talking about something that is real and having these deeper experiences and just opening ourselves up to having those. And, like I said, I think that's been part of my own journey, is being like, okay, I want to be intellectually respectable and I believe in science, and I went through this deconstruction and I used to believe this and now I don't believe that, but I still, find value in the Christian tradition and heritage. And I think there are ways in which this plane, this of reality, right, can be deeply spiritual in and of itself. Like I've been influenced by Buddhism a lot, the mindfulness thing, and yet, I'm struck, right, because like I'm a fan of Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a mindfulness practitioner, and he his whole thing is just present moment, just enjoying the simple things, what you eat, where you walk, right? But he has this is present in his writings, right? He'll kind of almost like talking and personifying in a way, right? The trees and everyday items and stuff like that. So you find these things present, even in the traditions that seem focused on just the materialistic aspect. Still, he's sort of persona and saying, my mother is, his mother passed away and he grieved his mother's death. And he was saying, my mother is present with me, walking, making footsteps with me in the soil. So there's all of these kind of, and that, that experience of him feeling like his mother was present with him came from a dream, right? He had a dream. He was mourning for his mother's death for a year. And then he had a dream and where his mother was so vividly present with him. So it's very interesting to note that was a result of a dream experience. I myself have had these, like I said, as skeptical as I might be on the surface, I went to a retreat, a weekend retreat. There was actually a Buddhist Christian retreat at the Providence Zen Center. And the day after the retreat, I had a dream that was like this profound emotional experience that I didn't remember until the next morning. But meeting with a woman, and I somehow intuitively felt that this was Mary was what came to mind, the mother of Jesus, right? And actually, just to mention too, in addition to that, I out of curiosity, as I've been, the book Soul Journeys has been on my mind, I decided to go and see, maybe I can find like a guided shamanic journey or whatever on YouTube, and I listened to a little bit, and they had the drumming and everything, and I was actually pretty nervous. I'm like, oh man, what if I really go into some strange state and get stuck there or something, But I did have this experience of where I the drumming kind of put me in this different state, and that I was listening to, and then Jesus showed up, and I had this kind of conversation with Jesus, right? And it's like, okay, here we are. So, and like you say, I mean, can I say that was definitely my imagination or not? I can't necessarily say that, but it was a very, very interesting and vivid experience in some ways. So yeah, very interesting,
And why is it either or? It was your imagination, and your encounter with Jesus was real.
Right. Imagination is not a limited thing.
Right.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
You're right. Our society is so black and white and binary thinking. And I do think we need to loosen up on that.
We all have filters that we put on realities. But at the same time, Winston, what was the effect of it? What was the fruit of that journey? What was it like for you then? What did that produce?
Well, like I said, I think in a way I've somewhat struggled on and off with anxiety, and I'm actually at the point of making a major transition in my life. My family and I we're located in the Boston area currently, but we're about to move our family of 5 to Minnesota for it looks like I have to be technically voted in still, but it's looking pretty good that I'm become the associate pastor of a church I'm really excited to be a part of out in Rochester, Minnesota. So there's a lot of maybe anxiety that's coming up, a lot of excitement and happiness as well, right? But in a way, I think I was kind of trying to come with that question of like, how do I sort of get a grip on all of this change that's coming, especially this would be enough as it is under normal circumstances, but throw a global pandemic in the mix and it's like, geez, it feels really anxiety provoking, the different, risks and exposures we might have along the way. So, but the experience was just basically Jesus, kind of reaching out to my heart and saying, you got to just trust more and trust that I'm with you at all times, and trust that you're going to be able to get through this. So right.
So if I was your spiritual director, I would say, what was God up to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say God was up to just showing up and being present for me, and trying to give me some support and reassurance. Yeah.
And also some instructions. Trust.
Right.
Strengthen that trust muscle.
Right.
It's hard to go wrong with that.
Yeah.
One of the things that Michael Harner said, which I over and over again find affirmed in my own practice, is it's not a question of what you believe, but what you experience. So I may still at times question, the reality of these visions that occur to me in a journey. And then what the impact is so unquestionable that I have to trust it comes from God, spirit, something.
Right.
That is compassionate and and desires to help. Yeah.
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 And
Yeah.
really, the proof is in the pudding. I mean, the wisdom that you bring back is healing.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it is so fascinating. And I think it is needed. I think that, right, it's like, I just feel like so many people who get disillusioned with religion and spirituality. So, right now, this is a big issue for all the mainline churches, is that membership is declining and people are walking away from it. And I mean, frankly, what's one of the big reasons for that? I think it's relatively obvious. I think one of the major reasons is that people aren't having authentic spiritual experience, right?
Right.
I mean, you write about that in your book a little bit, that, right, to give credit to shamanism is primarily an experiential spirituality rather than a religious system of beliefs. And Daniel, I think at one point you write here, people are less interested in knowing about God than in directly knowing God, building a relationship with the divine, and having personal experience of the sacred in living. I do think that's what we're hungry for today. We don't want to just do things out of obligation or just have this intellectual knowing or belief about the reality, but to really get the real deal, to have this experience for ourselves. And that is one of the things that I think is really fascinating about this, is you all are inviting people not to believe in this, to take your word for it, but to experience it for yourself.
And to know that there are safeguards built in. I think that was important. You mentioned, Winston, that you were pretty nervous about going into that, and so was I. When I did some of my first shamanic journeys, I wasn't sure. I carry all kinds of taboo kinds of cautionaries, from often from kind of Christian, more fundamentalist sources that aren't necessarily anything that I identify with, but it's there. And, so am I making myself subject to some kinds of delusional spirits, or is this going to manipulate me in some kind of a way? So I think to be able to kind of to know that within core shamanism, there are particular kinds of safeguards that are present, just as in Christian prayer. I think there is that sense that, we're called to be discerning about the spirit that we experience then too. And we can do that in both of those realms, with both of those traditions. And I think it's important that we are, that we're willing to be able to kind of test out, is this, what kind of, what is this, what kind of fruit is this trying to produce? What kind of, what seems to be behind this? That is this for well-being? Is it to kind of, is it delusional? What's going on? And being able to kind of test that kind of stuff out, and we can do that. So it's experiential, and we can also bring our critical faculties to that sense of discerning what's going on.
It really strikes me, I don't know, I feel like it's important to say that as we're talking about this, and I think of how many people might be listening and thinking, well, is this something strange and foreign and weird? To also remember that, this is part of the Christian tradition that is present, as you all have pointed out. And I think if we if we were able to have more time and can give more context for all that in this podcast, and explore that, and I'm sure if people read your books, right, that people realize there is a strong precedent for this in the Christian tradition, but even larger than that, in what it means to be human. Like going back to what you mentioned in the first opening sentence of the book, that we're talking about a tradition that goes back 30,000, 70,000 years. This is one of the oldest forms of human spirituality, and that spiritual practice, spiritual experience is part of what it means to be human. And to reclaim that in a way that there's in some sense we've sort of lost touch with that, it seems, in our society. And like, wait a second, like these kind of experiences have been with us from day one, and to own that and say this can be part of our experience of what it means to be human, and how important that might be for our well-being, you know.
Absolutely.
I think of it as sort of, widely speaking, an embrace of the mystical, which I think we're frightened of in our, broadly speaking, culture. You know, as you say, the materialist, science-minded, how can we really claim, or I'd say reclaim, the mystical, especially the mystical that is embodied and held within the material? When you were earlier talking about, you know, a tree and just like paying attention to what's physically present, the mystical is completely present in that. It's inherent. It's that level of spiritual reality that is infused in everything. And we've lost touch with that.
Yeah, I actually, that was one, I feel like we've sort of answered. I was going to ask this question, but I feel like we've sort of, you're touching on the answer to that question, and we've sort of have answered it throughout this conversation. But because when I was initially reading, I could see maybe some people reading it and saying, okay, going into these experiences in which you're communicating with spirits and whatnot, could potentially be seen as sort of an escape from this world and this life and this reality. And I wonder if some people might look at it as sort of escapist, instead of really being fully present in this life. But like you said, I think you're touching on that question, and even as I mentioned with my own experience, which is pretty limited at this point, but that, you know, you go into this experience and then you come back and you sort of bring back wisdom that is applicable in your daily life, and that affects your life in this moment now, right? Yeah.
And one of the things I really appreciate about core shamanism is that, you know, it really is kind of the distillation of these techniques that we find worldwide, whether you go to Siberia or the, you know, Pacific Islands, or you know, or Australia, the Aboriginal practices of Australia, that you know, if you drop into any one of these things, then you are within a religious cosmos and a religious system. But what Michael Harner was really doing, you know, as an anthropologist, was pulling out what are the common elements. So kind of pulling it out of a religious context and handing it to us as a set of techniques that we can use in our own religious context.
Right. Yeah.
And you know, and he's not saying I want you, you know, to believe in the, you know, in anything necessarily, but he is telling us what we will encounter. What will we see when we go on these journeys? Who will we meet? What you know, what does the world look like as far as how is it constructed? So he gives us a roadmap, which isn't religion. It's just saying, look, when you cross over here, here's what you're going to encounter. And he's right, and it's cool, and it works. And it doesn't require my allegiance to anything else. It's just, as far as I'm concerned, a prayer technique that helps bring me closer to Jesus, and is a very useful tool for me for spiritual discernment. And I think that, you know, you look at all the different religions, and we have all of these practices in common. Jews pray, Muslims pray, Christians pray, Hindus pray. We all pray. The beliefs differ depending on what the traditions are, but the practice is very similar. And so the practice of core shamanism, I think, shouldn't threaten us as Christians at all. It's just a really useful tool that we have not availed ourselves of yet, that can make us better Christian.
Right. Absolutely.
one of the things that has expanded for me in a lot of ways, when I started getting involved in core shamanism, it took me probably a year or so to really start sorting out my theology now, as I was engaging it, because it exploded my notion of prayer and exploded my notion of the cosmos and exploded my notion of who am I able to connect with? A kind of a core beautiful gift of Christianity is the notion of the communion of saints, where through God's love we're all connected, and the saints of the past and the saints, and those were, in the present. Well, what core shamanism did in those journeys exploded and expanded my notion of the community of saints. The community of saints now include trees and rocks and the cosmos, as well as not only angels and saints, but my deceased relatives and the ancestors, and it goes on and on and on, that I am connected and have the capacity to connect in limited ways, but can connect with this, with this incredible cosmos of God's creation, and say that we all belong. We all can be in communion. That that I'm just so grateful for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Thich Nhat Hanh, once again, he talked about sort of connecting with one's ancestors, and I actually I really had it really spoke to me in some way that I can't fully articulate. When I saw the latest Star Wars movie,
Star Wars is great.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But there was that moment where, right, not to give too many spoilers, I guess, but that character, I think her name was Rey, where she's trying to defeat the main villain, and she needs the help of the Jedi, and she kind of just she almost like she prays, just like, be with me, right? All the Jedi, and she looks up at the stars, and they show all of the Jedi throughout all history and time are sort of speaking, and all their sort of energy is sort of coming into her, and she's able to defeat the villain, right? But there was something that resonated with me about that as true, and it's hard to articulate why exactly, but because I think we all are interconnected. We are a continuation of our ancestors. We are standing on their shoulders, in more ways than one, right? So I think that's part of what we're talking about here. Is that Go ahead, John.
Well, this just so meshes with the Christian eschatological vision that God is through time and with every means at his disposal, bringing about the healing of everything broken.
Yeah.
And when you do shamanic journey work, you realize just how many parts of creation, just how many beings are invested in that same goal. Because when you go on a shamanic journey, you meet power animals, you meet you meet wisdom figures that are there. They're really there for you. They're really there to help you, to give you that wisdom, to bring healing. And that healing, is cumulative. When we heal, we don't hurt so much. We don't wound others quite so much. So one of the great revelations of doing this practice is just how not alone I am.
Yes. Yeah.
In this project,
Right.
and how much of the cosmos is on board with this project of God's of healing everything broken.
Well said. Well said. And actually, I feel like it may be appropriate to insert another quote. I think this was you, John, that wrote, "Shamanism reveals that all of creation, not just physical creation, but the vast world of spirit as well, loves us and cares about us and is guiding us beyond brokenness into right relationship with all things, creating healing in all four directions, healing those relationships with God, with each other, with the earth, and with our deeper selves. It reminds us that we are not in this alone, but we are part of a vast cosmic dance of interconnection and communion."
Wow.
Yeah, well said. So one other question that came up for me is, so to someone that's totally new to all this, how would one get involved or connected with others that can teach them and guide them in these types of practices? Where do you start? Where do you begin?
I know for me, it was really helpful to connect to an individual practitioner who could give me guidance and hold the space. Essentially, she was, at that point, I didn't even know what spiritual direction was, but she was like my shamanic mentor and spiritual director, teaching me, but also helping me know how to work with what had emerged and helping me explore it. I think the personal guidance is really helpful. You can do that in a live workshop also, but that's, of course, pretty specifically limited.
So where might one go to find that individual guidance?
Foundation for Shamanic Studies has a website which lists practitioners, people who are willing and able to meet with you, to talk with you. It can be done over Zoom. I've done this over Zoom with people. There's some technical challenges, but it can be done.
So just to clarify, so have you been able to go on like a shamanic journey being guided by somebody through Zoom?
I have we three have been in a group doing that together. And before that, also a group that used to meet in person, but now we meet on Zoom. But I've also done it as a spiritual director with a directee who wanted to explore shamanic work. And we worked on Zoom with her doing journeys and me holding the space for her while she did that.
Interesting. Okay. I feel like it's relevant to ask that in the COVID-19 time, so good to know.
It can be done for sure.
Yeah. Great.
But I do think yes that it's really important. Just as if people want to get into depth dimensions of prayer, people want to get into exploring things like shamanic journeys. I think it's really important to have a good well-trained spiritual guide to be present. I think there's something really important about having someone that can kind of mentor us and hear us and help us unpack what we're experiencing. And so, spiritual directors can do that. In terms of particular shamanic techniques, yes, I think it's important to probably either have someone that's been trained, like on the website at Foundation for Shamanic Studies, or some of the similar programs that deal with core shamanism, that can be helpful, or to take to enter into the programs for training. Of course, the three of us have done that. We've done training through the foundation. There are other programs as well, but I think also it's just really helpful to have someone that is also can be a spiritual guide and mentor, to be able to hear us and help us unpack. And of course, that's been, for the three of us, that's been a significant part of our own service that we offer people is in spiritual guidance work.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So I see we're coming pretty close probably to the end of our time. Any other pressing thoughts or things you wanted to share with us, the second table audience? Yeah.
No, I think it's been a terrific conversation, and I think we've covered all the main points. We could go on forever, of course. There's so much to this to talk about. But one of the reasons we wrote the book.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
I think one thing I'd add would be that what we didn't get into probably is at least Christian experiences of evil, and are there spirits that can be behind those experiences, and what do we do about those? So there's that sense of that the book will also introduce some thoughts and practices around that as part of, again, seeing those as healing processes, rather than just kind of casting out the kind of muscular approach that has been, that has often been kind of depicted. This is a very different kind of very compassionate approach for working with spirits that are kind of unattached or kind of lost, or and are trying to connect up with people and that kind of thing. So I'd like to mention at least that sense that we do address some of that as well.
Yeah, and related to that, to what Daniel's saying, that the guidelines for how you do shamanic journeys, there are safety guidelines so that you don't end up encountering some of these spirits that might have some malevolent or just misguided intent that could be harmful, because that is something that is present within the concept of what this non-ordinary reality is, but there are ways to not get into that situation.
Interesting. Yeah, so I guess people if you're interested, based on what you've heard here, definitely check out the book Soul Journeys by Daniel Prechtel, John Mabry, and Katrina Leathers. Definitely enjoyed reading it, and it's been a wonderful conversation. I hope people will dig deeper into this and learn more about it and go on their own journeys. I've been really honored, and thank you for your time here, being guests on the Second Table podcast. It's been so much fun talking.
Thanks so much.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for what you do.
Thank you so much.
All right. Till next time. Thanks for listening.